ראשון הדוברים יהיה פרופסור Sanford Budick. Professor Budick received his BA, you said AB, but it's from Harvard University in 1963, and his PhD from Yale University in 1966. He was successively associate professor, then full professor of English at Cornell University. Two of his books each won the Hanford Award of the Milton Society for the best book on Milton's poetry. He has been the recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship and a Senior Fellowship of the National Endowment of the Humanities. He was the founding director of the Hebrew University Center for Literary Studies from 1980 to 2000. In 1985-86, he led a research group at the Institute of Advanced Studies, and subsequently, with Wolfgang Iser, a 3-year further research project in which Stanley Cavell, Jacques Derrida, Jeffrey Hartman, and Frank Kermode were key participants. 3 of Budick's books that are particularly relevant to his lecture this evening are The Western Theory of Tradition, Terms and Paradigms of the Cultural Sublime, Yale University Press, 2000, Kant and Milton, Harvard University Press, 2010, and Hazarding All, Shakespeare and the Drama of Consciousness, published last year in the University of Edinburgh series on Shakespeare and philosophy. He made Aliyah in 1970 with his late wife, Emily Budick, who held the Edelman Chair in American Literature at the Hebrew University. He and Emily were brought to the Hebrew University English Department by Ruth Nevo and H.M. Dalesky, both members of the Academy, I add. Sandy, please.
Okay. My subject is theatricalization in Shakespeare's representation of politics. Some suggestions. Professor Ruth Nevo was a renowned Shakespeare scholar who, to say the least, greatly valued aesthetic experience. At the same time, she held steadfastly to clear political convictions. On this occasion, I will try to describe, in a few of Shakespeare's works, the relation between aesthetic experience and the possibility of holding political convictions that, as Shakespeare would have it, may be authentically chosen by an authentic self. I propose that Shakespeare's view of these matters is that only through aesthetic experience can we attain to a freedom of a self, and that only such a self is in a position to commit in freedom to political values and acts that, for that self, embody freedom. Paradoxically, to achieve this aesthetic experience, Shakespeare most especially shapes and directs the aesthetic experience of theater against the minds, the imagination's habitual inauthenticities of theatricalization. Let's see if I can get this right now. Yeah. By theatricalization, I mean the oscillations between role-playing and a would-be non-role-playing that is itself never free from fictive role-playing. As a result, our imaginations, our lives, may perpetually linger in a condition of posing as something that misses who we most deeply, most freely are. Shakespeare shows that politics tends to create the extreme cases of such theatricalization. To be sure, it is by no means self-evident that it is possible to discover a free self, or even how to conceive of a self that would not be role-playing. Nor is it at all obvious what might supply an antidote to the inauthenticity of the theatricalizing self. Shakespeare provides responses to these challenges. From within the imagination's resources of theatricalization themselves, he shows how theatricalization can be suspended and overcome. I will explain how he achieves this in an effectively endless mirroring and reverse doubling of theatricalization. In these repeated mirrorings or reverse doublings, which constitute the figure of chiasmus, of A, B, B, A, the role-playing of theatricalization, of theater, and its fictionality is suspended. This special kind of aesthetic impact begins to make possible the disclosure of the playwrights and the spectators' free selves, even, we shall suggest, a substantive experience and idea of humanity. In Shakespeare's oeuvre as a whole, the template pronouncement of this goal of overcoming theatricalization is articulated by Hamlet. Hamlet's pursuit of revenge, quote, with wings as swift as meditation, is secondary to something far more important at least to him. This is the disclosure to himself, precisely in meditation, of the inward self that he has claimed from the beginning, quote, that within which passes show. We recall that when Hamlet's mother asks him to, quote, cast his nighted color off together with what seems to be his continued mourning, he responds sharply, bitterly, saying, let's see if I can get this right now. No? There it is. Seems, madam? Nay, it is. I know not seems. A man might play at such shows of grief, but I have that within which passes show. This affirmation of the self against theatricalization, against meaningless show, will turn out to be aimed not only against false mourning, but against the corrupt language, the corrupt representation of reality in the court politics that surrounds him, in the mendacious role-playing of Polonius and Claudius, and even his erstwhile friends Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. With the professional purveyors of theatricalization, the newly arrived players, Hamlet mercilessly pursues his attack on the falsity of role-playing. With sustained anger, virtual rage, he shouts out that his preoccupation with reforming the activity of playing comes from the depth of his being. Quote, "Oh, it offends me to the soul. Oh, there be players. Oh, reform it altogether." Hamlet's most significant confrontation with the emptiness of theatricalization, serving virtually as a template for all his other employments of this figure, is his self-accusatory chiastic question concerning the player's capacity to feel and to express emotion. After asking about that emotion, whether it is all for a meaningless affect, all for nothing, he asks further, in the reverse doubling or mirroring of chiasmus, that is, in the configuration in the configuration of chiasmus A-B-B-A, what's Hecuba to him, or he to her, that he should weep for her? Lisa Frankel has noted that the impact of chiasmus stems from the fact that its elements necessarily form an effectively infinite progression because, quote, repetition becomes inversion, and inversion takes us back to where we started. As a result, she says, chiasmus initiates an exchange that seems to have no beginning and no end. Frankel adds that chiasmus, quote, precludes a present. The now itself, she says, is lost, leaving an odd temporality, end quote. In Hamlet, however, this observation about a lost now is only true for the precluded present and lost now of chronological temporality. Indeed, for Hamlet, a different kind of now is at the heart of all his experience, such that he even monumentalizes it within his most oracular chiasmus. If it be now, 'tis not to come. If it be not to come, it will be now. These clauses are tightly driven by the effects of chiasmus that produce an atemporal space of the now. Here the now emerges from within the thematizations of the chronological now, not, however, from the thematizations per se, but from the aesthetic formalism in which the thematizations are embedded. The effect of this formalism needs to be explained. Shakespeare's procedures in overcoming theatricalization through his employment of chiasmus are illuminated by close parallels in the meditative line of phenomenology that begins with Edmund Husserl. Husserl shows that only through the disconnection of all belief positings Can we overcome the inauthenticity of living naively in perceiving and experiencing acts of positing in which unities appear, which seem to be actual? We can achieve this disconnection in what Husserl calls the epoche. In the epoche, we, quote, parenthesize or bracket the falsifications of belief positings. Instead of living in them, instead of affecting them, we affect acts of reflection directed to them. This is Husserl, yes. We are now living completely in such acts of the second degree. In Hegel's term for such experience, we are now living in a space of negativity. By, quote, performing the epoche, Husserl says, each person, quote, lays bare the transcendental onlooker in himself, the transcendental onlooker in himself. He passes into him. This onlooker, however, he says, does not first come to be by the epoche, but is only freed of the shrouding cover of human being. End quote. What is more, the epoche of bracketing produces an atemporal now, the Jetztzeit, the now, that Walter Benjamin found in Husserl and celebrated in his own thesis on the philosophy of history. In Husserl's own Benjamin-like language, when, quote, we blast open captivation in an acceptedness, we produce this unique atemporality within the present moment, a free now. Although, to my knowledge, Husserl did not comment directly on the figure of chiasmus, an extensive exploration of the chiasm is prominent in Merleau-Ponty's unfolding of Husserl's concept of the ineinander, or intertwining. My aim in applying to Husserl's ideas is not to find the ways in which Shakespeare's practice matches Husserl's theories. Husserl, in my view, amalgamated a coherent schema from meditative concepts and practices that were already available in their elements to Shakespeare. Indeed, the concrete efficacy of Shakespeare's effectively endless repetitions is already that it produces just such a bracketing and its space of negativity, together with the now and the condition of the onlooker. Although, interestingly enough, Husserl did not himself reach an account of the way the bracketing of the epoche can actually, in practice, be achieved, a powerful philosophical explanation of exactly this thing is not far to seek. As Husserl surely realized, but did not acknowledge, Kant supplied just such a means for producing something closely equivalent to the epoche and to Shakespeare's experience of negativity within chiasmus. Kant did so in his writings on the sublime, specifically in what he calls the mathematically sublime, where his serviceability with regard to Shakespeare is not surprising, since he elsewhere identified Shakespeare with Milton as one of the two greatest modern geniuses. He didn't think that Newton was a genius, but Shakespeare and Milton were. For Kant, an experience of the sublime and of the space of the negative are intertwined. In the Analytic of the Sublime, of the third critique, Kant described an experience of, a, quote, a momentary check, eine augenblicklichen Hemmung, to consciousness that runs parallel to his account of a transcendental deduction in the first critique. It too amounts to a transcendental deduction in that after the check in the experience of the sublime, the mind recovers, quote, an immediately following and all the more powerful consciousness of its independent powers, particularly its freedom. Good. Kant explains that the suspension of consciousness of the external world in the sublime is occasioned by a particular kind of aesthetic encounter, namely of trying and failing to grasp the totality of an effectively endless progression of items in a given field of consciousness. Encounters of this kind, he argues, are most familiar in experiences of natural phenomena, but he makes clear that they are also to be found in experiences of works of art. In other words, in such aesthetic encounters, the mind's chosen act of momentarily bracketing consciousness of the world is enabled by a momentary check to consciousness in the sublime. In the momentary condition that is produced in this way, the mind experiences a suspension of the world's spatio-temporality, in effect a negativity, in which the residual self reposes in total freedom in its own special temporality, having removed, Kant says, quote, having removed the time condition. Seen with the help of Husserl's and Kant's terms for understanding experience of the epoche and the sublime, we can more easily grasp the vast importance of an effectively endless series of chiasmata, each of which generates its own impact of endless repetition. Hamlet's, Shakespeare's management of chiasmus subsumes and builds upon the mind's initial condition of narcissism, some would say a primary narcissism. In Shakespeare's terms, the narcissism of role-playing and gazing at ourselves from another turn of role-playing. In other words, in theatricalization. Shakespeare's mirrorings and doublings in chiasmus and the kind of consciousness that they achieve have little or nothing in common with Lacan's account of an infantile mirror stage, or even Lacan's later revised accounts of mirror perception. For Shakespeare, when we visualize and conceive the chiastic mirroring, the reverse doubling of our own narcissistic role-playings, our own theatricalization, two things occur simultaneously. One, the suspension of the narcissistic self by dint of the sublime experience of the endless repetitions that are set in motion within the mirroring that is chiasmus. Two, the birth of awareness by the mirror observer of the endless plurality of other minds or imaginations in their interactions of theatricalization and even their possibility of overcoming theatricalization, as does the mirror observer. I propose that for Shakespeare, a substantive experience and idea of humanity comes into being precisely here. Thus, for Hamlet, the deeper, quote, purpose of playing, not for himself, but for humanity, is indeed, quote, first and now to hold the mirror up to nature, the mirror up to nature. For Shakespeare, even such seemingly innocent statements as that spoken by cynical Jaques in As You Like It, quote, all the world's a stage and all the men and women merely players, is not a neutral observation. Within the unfoldings of language in that play, this statement too hints at the duplicities of the theatricalizing self that, in Shakespeare's view, are rampant in human behavior. For Shakespeare, chiastic mirroring is not merely a rhetorical invention. Rather, it represents for him, it discloses the inherent capacity of the human imagination to overcome its role-playing or narcissistic theatricalization, to achieve an onlooking in freedom of the self, and then to participate in a dynamic experience of humanity. I believe that the profound purpose of this chiastic mirroring, of the chiasm in this particular sense, can be extrapolated to a general theory of aesthetic experience, but that is a subject for another occasion. I also won't detour from these remarks to any contemporary political events or persons, though in broaching political topics it is probably impossible for each of us not to sum it up in our own minds what we may feel are current corresponding phenomena. As you may be aware, quite recently, in the Trump years of the United States, Stephen Greenblatt published a study centered in Shakespeare's Richard III that he entitled Tyrant, Shakespeare on Politics. Without once mentioning Trump's name, possibly so that Trump could have no hold on him in a libel suit, it is unmistakable that the entire book is written to expose what Greenblatt considers to be the tyranny of Trump's presidency. The remainder of my remarks this evening is in fact focused on Shakespeare's Richard III, not, however, to confirm or dispute Greenblatt's Trump-Richard III equation. Rather, I suggest that Shakespeare's principal goal in this play, as in his representation of blood-soaked politics in many other of his plays, is to achieve a freedom of the self by using the theatricality of theater to confront and to overcome the inauthenticity of the self's theatricalization. I turn now to the tragedy of Richard III. Beginning with Richard's first word, the word which opens the play, now, he serves as Shakespeare's archetype of theatricalization and of everything that Shakespeare works to metamorphose from that theatricalization. Speaking here, solus, Richard's absolute narcissism plays to himself alone, seeks only to ingratiate himself to himself, to creep, as he says, in favor with myself. Now is the winter of our discontent made glorious by this sun of York, and all the clouds that lowered upon our house in the deep bosom of the ocean buried, since I cannot prove a lover, to entertain these fair well-spoken days, I am determined to prove a villain. and hate the idle pleasures of these days. Plots have I laid, inductions dangerous. Richard's theatricalization even empties soliloquy of its quondam authenticity. Yet from the first moment that Richard speaks, Shakespeare is extracting an anti-world that overcomes all theatricalization. This anti-world is the world of the onlooker playwright and the onlooker spectator. Thus, in this play, an overwhelming circularity controls the valences of representation. The playwright's onlooker point of view, which he has already acquired by conceiving the effectively endless series of repetitions that he now proceeds to record, transmutes the entire series of representations of horror, all of its inductions dangerous, into a gallery of pictures whose affective import is completely taken over by the aesthetic impact of the sublime. Here, the images of horror are by the onlooker playwright finally rendered no more life-threatening than the fearful overhanging boulders of a mountain in Kant's famous exemplification of the experience of the sublime. In other words, while Richard sets this series in motion for his dark purposes, the onlooker playwright and the onlooker spectator press the same series in a different order of representation into a very different service. Richard III was composed 7, perhaps 9 years before Hamlet. The aesthetics of chiasmus and mirroring that Hamlet articulates within his play is already evident in the earlier play, but here there is no consciousness of it by any of the protagonists who are merely elements within the chiasmata. Here the impact of that aesthetics is already no less powerful than in Hamlet, but in Richard III it is experienced only by the playwright and the spectator or reader. Since my time is beginning to run out, I will particularly instance one chiasmus of the play that has been ably mapped by William Davis, though Davis does not explain the sources or dynamics of its aesthetic impact. This chiasmus is one of Queen Margaret's curses addressed to Queen Elizabeth in the first act. I reproduce Davis's mapping of the chiasmus in all its staggering detail of reverse doublings. Remember, this is Margaret, Queen, addressing Elizabeth, Queen. Thyself a queen, for me that was a queen. Outlive thy glory like my wretched self. Long mayest thou live to wait long mayest thou live to wait thy children's death, and see another as I see thee now, decked in thy rights as thou art stoled in mine. Long die thy happy days before thy death, and after many lengthened hours of grief, die neither mother, wife, nor England's queen. As impressive as this gigantic chiasmus is, its aesthetic impact is completely lost on the speaker herself, since she is totally immersed in the desire for revenge and the fever of cursing. Only the onlooker playwright and the spectator can take in the aesthetic object that is here created, can benefit from its impact, can use it to find a free self. Just so, an unembarrassed theatricalization is highlighted in Buckingham's announcement, "Tut, I can counterfeit the deep tragedian." Within Shakespeare's design, this counterfeit role-playing plunges Buckingham into a life of duplicities. It empties his life of meaning, just as it furthers the emptying of values in English politics. In his own words, at the moment of being led to be beheaded, that politics is a mere oscillation of wrongs for which all are reciprocally to blame. Wrong hath but wrong, and blame the due of blame. Most shockingly, perhaps, this endless series of enacted hypocrisies, lies, and lethal aggressions includes the women commentators on Richard's horrors. Their suffering is no less the outcome of degraded role-playing than that of the men who form the play's parade of self-interest. The women in this play are motivated, that is, by vain self-aggrandizement, hardly less than by the instinct of self-preservation, whether for themselves or their families. These women come to see that the roles that they and their families have indeed been so ambitious to play have been rife with deadly duplicities. Queen Margaret rails principally at the other women, opening with this chiasmus that governs everything she has to say. Hear me, you wrangling pirates that fall out in sharing that which you have pilled from me. Later, she even shows acute awareness of the theatrical frame of the women's collective catastrophe, yet she cannot step back to see the theater and mirroring in which she is a player. Thy Edward, he is dead that killed my Edward. Thy other Edward, dead to quit my Edward. And the beholders of this frantic play, the adulterate Hastings, Rivers, Vaughan, Gray, untimely smothered in their dusky graves. As if to point to the endless repetition of chiastic patterning in the entirety of Richard III, the climactic scene of Dreams in Act 5 rings out hammered blows of chiastic inevitability. One by one, the ghosts of Richard's victims appear to him and alternately to the Richmond who will kill Richard, again and again repeating variations of the chiastic mirroring that places their antithetical fates in the mirroring that we see, we experience. To Richard, the ghosts say, despair and die. To Richmond, live and flourish. Thus, the play's repetition series of chiastic rebound pursues the reader as what may seem to be a nightmare. Without doubt, the play represents this nightmare world of political theatricalization. But rightly understood, within Shakespeare's aesthetic design, the impact of this gigantic repetition series offers the spectator or reader a vast blessing. This is the blessing of at least momentarily finding a self that is free from any role-playing and that discovers that self, remarkably enough, within an experience of the newly accessible thing that is humanity. To conclude, the whole of the aesthetic impact of the play Richard III is already recorded in its first word, now. Totally different from, even antithetical to, Richard's speaking of this now. This is the inward now that the playwright has already experienced in completing the play and that he now proceeds to make available to the spectator or reader. This now is generated in the experience of the sublime that is produced by the endless series of chiastic representations which Richard's inductions dangerous have set in motion. This now is the same as the Husserlian Jetztzeit, opened up by the epoche, the same as Kant's, quote, removal of the time condition in the check of the sublime, and the same as Hamlet's it will be now. This is the now to which the spectator will attain by the end, when she or he exits the experience of theater itself. Momentarily, at least, the spectator who experiences the sublime of this now has gained access to a self that is free of role-playing. Equipped with this kind and this measure of authenticity, such a free self, Shakespeare suggests, may confront the duplicitous theatricalization of politics with a newly won authenticity of free and even human choosing. Thank you.